In 2015, the historic Paris Agreement brought together national representatives of most of the countries in the world to address climate change as a very real and immediate threat. But climate planning isn't just limited to the national level. There are a lot of climate initiatives that address the subnational level, and by subnational I mean region, city, state, or provinces. Through literature review, gap analysis, and interviews, our capstone group assessed how countries are internally sharing and communicating climate information between national and state governments. From this, we developed a tool that aggregates national and subnational climate action, identifies gaps in quantification and funding, and guides users towards solutions. So first, I'd like to cover some more background and our clients, and then I'll take you through the interview and the surveys that we conducted. I'll also arrive at our key findings, which will lead us into our tool, CAPI. And then I'll end on a summary slide to make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's focus in on how these commitments work within a country. Here we've got Mexico, which as a country submitted a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, at the Paris Summit. Several states of Mexico, including Yucatan, which is pictured here, have made their own climate commitments. We can think of them like pieces of a puzzle fitting together. So when you put all of these states together, you end up with the national agreement, the national climate commitment. We focused on a specific subnational commitment, the Under 2 Memorandum of Understanding. 170 subnational and national signatories around the world, including Yucatan and other Mexican states, have committed to keeping the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius through this Under 2 MOU. Now, if the NDC is made without taking into account these state commitments, or vice versa, the picture in the country can be incomplete. So, for example, Yucatan has pledged to reduce their carbon output by 20% from their 2005 levels. But the Mexican NDC pledged to 25% from BAU, or business as usual. So let's take a step back from this for a second. We've got the Paris Agreement and NDCs from there. We've got state agreements and some appendices or any commitments made at that level. In an ideal world, these governments and these departments would be working together to achieve their mutual goals. But in reality, what does this effective coordination and communication look like? What are some of the barriers to collaboration? And are national governments even keeping track of what their states, cities, and provinces are promising? This is what we were tasked with answering. Our clients are the Governor of California's office and the London-based Climate Group. Both are heavily involved in the Under 2 MOU, and they wanted us first to help them better understand how national governments and states are coordinating climate actions, and secondly, to develop an innovative framework to better integrate climate planning. So to do this, our team did conduct an in-depth literature review of current best practices. We wanted our focus to be on solutions. But we also talked to people in these countries actually in charge of coordinating and implementing climate strategies. We interviewed over 20 staff and experts in positions ranging from expert policy advisor to national coordinator for climate change and low carbon development. We took transcriptions of our interviews and textually analyzed them for themes both within a given country and between countries. Then, to solidify these themes, we sent out follow-up surveys to interviewees, which provided a quantifiable backing for our findings and for our proposed solutions. So, frankly, we and our clients weren't too sure going in if there was any communication regarding climate commitments taking place between most national and subnational governments. But what we found is that every government we talked to was communicating and is currently trying to align their national and state strategies. So for example, Canada is in the process of implementing a pan-Canadian framework on climate change. The Mexican national government is launching climate pilot initiatives this year to connect and support states. Brazil holds quarterly meetings of state sustainability experts. There's a consolidation of greenhouse gas inventory methods in Argentina, and Peru is designing registration systems trying to homogenize state climate metrics. So this is great news. But these developments are more or less brand new. To put it succinctly, one staff member from a Canadian province that we talked to said that if we had called 3 years ago, he would not have had much to say. And we did discover that despite this progress, there are challenges facing these governments that do still need to be addressed. So let's return to Yucatan in Mexico. Our interviews with Yucatan revealed that, quote, even with a platform, there's not a clear path for working together to achieve goals. Yucatan expressed that Mexican states do not participate in the national climate change system, not because they don't want to, but because there's no framework for doing so. So this speaks to an overarching theme that we found in our research, feeling like states don't have a voice or influence despite the fact that they may communicate with their national government. Aligned with this is the theme for the need for standard quantification. Standard quantification was specifically identified as one of the mechanisms that could support climate action goals in all of our interview countries. This lack of quantification in many cases can lead to our third key finding in the challenges section, which is misalignment. Misalignment can also arise because national plans are not specific enough for the different regions. So in Mexico, interviewees want these national plans tailored to the specifications of different regions. So let's look at Brazil for a second, where we see this exact misalignment in action in São Paulo. Interviewees there noted that the national climate plan doesn't include any applicable goals to São Paulo. The national plan focuses on agricultural and deforestation-based emissions, but São Paulo is primarily an industrial state. So this led to the state ending up creating their own climate commitment, which is great, but ultimately it doesn't align with the national goals. Now at the national level, we found that lack of quantification and misalignment of goals are problems for them too. The national government don't see how these strategies contribute to national goals if the target dates are misaligned, such as we saw with Yucatan, or if different methodologies are used, or if the states just aren't quantifying their goals at all. So we're faced with all of these challenges I just went through. Add to that the fact that 75% of our survey respondents want best practices. They want some of the solutions that other countries or other regions or other states are implementing so that they can then take them and apply that to their own region. So with this, and given the lack of a framework for keeping tabs on state and national level goals, our team developed a report and a novel tool in alpha stage that facilitates the analysis of gaps between national and subnational climate commitments and actions. We can think of the puzzle analogy again here. Our tool puts the puzzle pieces of each state together to determine if the picture at the national level is complete. So, designed for use at the national and state level, CAPI, or the Climate Action Portal for Integration of National and Subnational Commitments, would be an online but internally used portal that allows users to select their jurisdiction, then fill in data such as their emissions reduction goal and year, their baseline assumptions, and then, by sector, whether specific mitigation actions have been quantified and funded. This shows how each state's goals contribute to national targets and aggregates progress while pointing out gaps in pledges and financing. Just to note, 100% of our survey respondents express uncertainty about having the funding to meet their climate goals. With this, national and subnational governments can work together to effectively pool resources, share information, and fund actions. Going back to the CAPI homepage, we see that there's also a solutions section. It allows individuals to select their level of jurisdiction. So let's say that I am the climate change director of Jalisco in Mexico. I could choose a metric such as GDP, the climate action area, or even level of centralization within my country. Clicking go here takes me to a page with similar countries or states based on whatever metric I selected, with links to some of the solutions they are using. This model we've developed addresses fundamental gaps between national and subnational climate commitments while promoting transparency and the quantification and funding of actions. It provides tailored solutions and best practices that can help propel work forward. So, to sum up everything that I just talked about, I want you to walk away from here knowing 3 things. Firstly, a lack of coordination within a country can and does create funding and commitment gaps. And if you don't have aligned goals, how can you have aligned action? But it's also not so surprising that there are gaps because there's currently no framework, no standard framework for incorporating subnational goals into national action plans. While there are great country-specific initiatives like the Pan-Canadian Framework that I mentioned earlier, they are not easily transferable to other regions and may not address all challenges. Finally, it's important for us to recognize that there just is no one-size-fits-all solution because governments and regions are just structured differently. But the tool that we created here is flexible and adaptable enough to be effective at the national and subnational levels of pretty much any country tackling climate pledges. Our clients can now take these findings and our tool forward to create a tangible solution for climate coordination so that the Paris Agreement and other climate initiatives actually do succeed. And with that, are there any questions?
That was terrific, thank you. I'm curious if your tool would enable states to collaborate with one another to accomplish a limit below 2 degrees centigrade without engaging the national government in case that government, for example, were uninterested in solving the climate change problem.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's interesting that you should mention that. In all of our interviews, political will or lack thereof was brought up as one of the biggest barriers to successful climate action, and it does honestly make a lot of sense. So our interviewees from Canada mentioned that the previous administration to the current Trudeau administration actually meant that they weren't getting a whole lot done regarding climate change. So yes, this tool could be used by just the states since it is an internal portal. I mean, ultimately one of its other functions is to aggregate all of the state commitments together such that they could be compared to the national goal. But yeah, it could be fundamentally used just by the states, which can be really important for things like allocation of funding or even pooling together the resources so that states as a group can apply for international funding. So, you know, for example, we did interview Peru, and in Peru they said that one of their projects got funding from the Global Climate Fund specifically because the fund saw that the government could help the state actually implement climate projects. That's great when the national government can help. When they can't, states can work together to make sure that they're achieving their climate goals. So yeah, great question, thank you.
Other questions for Alexis? One there and the last one.
So I really liked your Excel tool, and I also liked how you presented it. I'm just curious because I think with Excel, these things come with a certain learning curve that I would think would be really hard for some nations. I mean, I think people who work with Excel every day don't really see that there is a learning curve with people who may not use it ever. So how do you, is this something you considered in making it simple, user-friendly, and how are you going to overcome you know, working with people or nations who maybe don't have exposure to Excel?
Sure, also a great question, thank you. So I guess this can also be flipped around. Ultimately, we're picturing that this tool will be taken up by the climate group and implemented actually as a web portal. So it won't actually be Excel-based in its final form, it's just in alpha form right now. It needs quite a bit more testing before it even enters beta form. The only reason why we presented it in Excel is because, unfortunately, none of us know how to do web coding. So it will be quite simple and straightforward. The idea is that it's going to standardize as much as possible while also going into a necessary level of detail. So you hit on some of the important metrics that are understandable by pretty much any country, such as what funding is required and what projects are being taken upon, what is their baseline year, what is their target year, what is their target emissions reduction. It's all fairly straightforward, and then the tool itself would go ahead and aggregate those all together to see what it looks like from the national level. And then in terms of the second aspect of the tool, which is the solutions guide, that also will be pretty straightforward. Like you saw in the video, and I can go back and show it again if you guys would like. As you saw in the video, all you have to do is select whether you're representing the national or subnational, what country you're from, what state you're from, and then you can choose a comparison metric. and it'll automatically pull up similar countries or states based on that metric with solutions that they've applied that you can then apply to your own country. So it, as a whole, will be very straightforward and it won't require any Excel learning curve.
Final question.
First, thank you so much for your presentation. Very passionate and comprehensive. Congratulations. Final question. Are you aware if these governments are also having a central policy that they deep down into the sub-levels, for example, for other areas like water, or is just for greenhouse gas emissions?
Thank you. That's also a good question. So some of the initiatives that we looked at are focusing on other indicators, so not just greenhouse gas emissions. We chose within our study to focus primarily on greenhouse gas emissions, but some of the sectors that our tool covers aren't just energy or waste. They also will be things like water intensity and usage. So, for instance, we have what I mentioned earlier on, which is the Pan-Canadian Framework for Climate Change. That does, again, focus primarily on greenhouse gas emissions, but there are aspects to that framework that address some of the other areas that you mentioned that I personally think are kind of integral to the entire country climate plan. So yes, it is happening. It's not currently happening at a level that it can be applied to many different countries, and it's not happening everywhere, especially at a national to subnational level.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.